Agreed.
On both sides. So, just to give you the quick intro, and I will ask you at some point, helping the baseline will help to know kind of what you heard so far from Moses. Just make sure it's either accurate or incorrect if it's not. But, my role within GPLA, obviously I'm on the East Coast. I'm not in California. I came on board about a year ago. Greg Luke started the firm, and Greg is slowly but surely working his way towards retirement. Date's not set, but certainly within a year is what we're planning for.
Mm-hmm.
So my role really is stepping in and taking over in Greg's place as he retires. Greg and I have known each other for many years, had a lot of shared beliefs and values. I owned an engineering company here on the East Coast that I sold several years ago. So anyway, the long and short of it is, Greg sold his firm to DPR about 2 years ago. And really, so, our goal is sort of twofold. One, to build on the legacy that Greg built and his approach. Two, to really grow the firm, to be able to be an effective team member for DPR. And, try to really advance some of the ideas that Greg had been pushing on. And, coincidentally, in my own firm, we were doing a lot of the same thing. And so, really the organization is centered around this idea that engineering is more than just doing a set of plans. And so, in-house, we obviously have a full structural engineering capability, but we also have a full, group that can do detailing and fabrication drawings for structural steel, for rebar, for light gauge steel, metal, pretty much anything structural that goes in a job. We have the capability to take the drawings directly to a fabrication level of accuracy and really effectively eliminate the traditional shop drawing process completely for for clients that are interested in doing that. I would say we do it on about maybe 3/4 of our projects. And the spectrum, and those are all over the country. Historically, the company, Greg had a footprint in the California pool world. They do DSA jobs in the Bay Area generally.
Mm-hmm.
And the other really big footprint they have is nationally in the casino world. And very, very different dynamics as you can imagine. But, the DSA world, they don't just do any school. They really developed an entire proprietary pre-approved concept that they use that goes by FOLIA. And so, what I would say is most of what GPLA does is really centered around trying to, bring either very creative, engineering, performance-based design engineering to the table, or, be part of a highly integrated design and construction team. And, so we're not really a traditional firm in the sense of just doing work for architects and that's the end of it. So, that's the really quick encapsulation of it. I can imagine there's many more questions go along with that. With that being said, I'd love to hear, number one, a little bit more about your background, kind of the path you walked. I obviously saw, what jumped out at me on the resume is a lot of really relevant experience in parts of the country where we do a lot of work, right?
Yes.
We do work in Texas, we do work in California, and so that's certainly appealing. The experience with DSA and with the California regulatory agencies is a real plus for us. Whereas they don't necessarily see us taking huge amounts of DSA work outside of FOLIA, DPR is obviously a very large hospital builder in California. And, there would be a really nice advantage for us to have somebody who's familiar with OSHPD and all of the fine details of their expectations, so to speak. So, love to hear you just talk a little bit about your path. And again, I saw Moses jumped on, but help me just baseline how much you know so far, and then that way I know where we got gaps we got to fill in.
Okay, what I know so far, let's see, I know DPR because years ago, DPR was a contractor on one of my jobs many years ago. And I thought they did pretty good. And then I know Greg Luth because, he's well known here in the Bay Area pretty much. And that, he became part of DPR, which I was a little shocked, to be honest, when I heard it, but now I know what's going on because that's the way the market is these days. So for the past 25 years, I've pretty much been designing and reviewing buildings of all types. Most of it's been in the seismic realm, which is California and Washington State, which Washington State has big earthquakes too. So I've been dealing with all the materials, 20 years designing buildings, 5 years reviewing them, and it wasn't intentional. What happened during some of the time was that a lot of the companies downsized during the Great Recession. A lot of the firms got rid of their designers because they had no work for them to do, and that caused me to go into working for a city, and then after that I went into business for myself, and for me that was okay. It put, food on the table and, kept the house over my head, but I got sick of, the reason I'm looking for something with more stability is because I don't want to keep leaving to go to different areas of the country. That's very hard on me, especially, having a daughter. That's very difficult, so that's why I've been looking to stay here and as much as I can. Obviously, I don't have a problem going to job sites and stuff, but pretty much I've been doing the design work, so it's schools, hospitals, high-rise, low-rise, everything in between, light gauge, steel, your steel, wood, concrete, masonry. And the light gauge, I think that's going to pick up in the future because in certain areas they can't have wood because they have termites. So that's a big problem. Or if it's a building where it's exposed to water, you don't want to have wood because it will dry rot out. So that's me in a nutshell, pretty much.
Into some of that? Is it mostly just doing jobs that were subject to that review?
That's how.
Actually, I thought they were mostly internal, correct?
DSA reviews internally. Here's what's going on, and I don't know if you're familiar with the West Coast. In California, back in the 1930s, I'll give you the history, there was a law passed after the Long Beach earthquake in 1933, giving the state the authority to review public schools. Because what was happening in those days was they were building them outside city lines, and if the school was in session that day, kids would have died. So the state passed a law saying we review all public schools because that's where kids go. And then basically it went to hospitals back in the 90s because during one of the earthquakes, I think it was Northridge, some of the hospitals collapsed. So the state got involved. That's why they're involved typically. It's not because they want to. It's because the way the law is written. And DSA is a real tough reviewer, and I always say with DSA, I tell people it depends who you're dealing with and what office. I've dealt with Sacramento, I don't have a problem because at least you can get somebody to talk to. The one here in Oakland, I've heard bits and pieces where people don't get any responses back. So as I say with DSA, it depends on the management. Yes, they're strict, and I've interviewed with them multiple times. It's a high bar to get in there. And then the last time I interviewed with them many years ago, they just pick people. I was told they just, use the dartboard approach to hiring people. Because everybody knew what they were doing. What's the point of having the interview and the test? Because the caliber's so high, And I've kept up.
I think the reviewer we just dealt with was in San Diego, but it was for a Bay Area project.
Oh, they sub out the work if the other offices are overloaded. And the reason I think the Bay Area is overloaded is because, we have a lot of construction going on. A lot of people moved out of the area during the pandemic, the big cities, so they're going outside, and with this work from home revolution. So there was an article today, a lot of them are going to Contra Costa County, which is the suburbs pretty much, because they want to have wide open spaces. They don't want to be cramped in an apartment. Well, a lot of people have dogs in this area. They've gotten dogs during the pandemic, and it's easier for them to just go outside, take a hike with them, because having a pet's healthy, and now it's big business.
Right.
because now a lot of your hotels are allowing dogs now. A lot of your restaurants are allowing them, so people take their dogs in. That's why I see a lot of the signs on hotels, like Motel 6 is an example, where they say, pets stay free.
Yeah, right. And so, in terms of how your role fit in, like previous organizations, obviously when you were working for your own organization for yourself, you're doing everything on the project. But looking prior to that, how did you? What was the roles that you were in? Were you leading and running projects? Were you working part of the team? Was it a little bit of both?
Actually, it's
Just kind of baseline where you were with all of that.
it depends on the size of the project. If it's a real big one, I'm part of a team. But if it's like a small one, I pretty much did everything, And then usually the principal got involved when I had questions, because you don't want to blow the budget on your projects. That was when I was an engineer that was younger back in the, decade ago, where I felt like I needed that guidance. Because if you don't come up with the efficient design, it doesn't get built. People get very angry because they can't build it. And it came in handy later because I ended up, in my private practice, I was working for a retrofit contractor when San Francisco had the retrofit boom, where they were required to fix the bottom floors of all the excuse my allergies. The apartment buildings had to be fixed. So what happened with him was he was hiring engineers that couldn't do the job. Basically, they would put stuff on paper and they couldn't afford it. It'd be way over budget. So I got called in as the second opinion to see, do they really need it? And what he and I found was that the engineers just put something down because the fee was low, pretty much. They lowballed it really, really low. And then when I got on board, a lot of the stuff was able to get built because it became a lot cheaper. So like a $500,000 retrofit went down to $20,000 because the engineer that did the retrofit forgot that there were concrete walls. And I worked with the San Francisco Building Department to see, okay, what do we put on the plans, that it's there so that they understand pretty much so it can get a permit. Because some of the buildings I bumped into in San Francisco didn't have building plans. Some of them were built. I had one built 1906 is when the San Francisco earthquake happened, so they wouldn't have them on film. It'd just be impossible to get because the technology wasn't around there then to preserve all the drawings.
Right. Yeah, I got you. I mean, obviously, East Coast we're used to that. We're always a little bit surprised when someone has plans for their building. When you have stuff going, certainly. I don't think I've ever seen a set of plans that was older than about the 1920s or 30s. Not much survived prior to that.
Okay. City of Seattle, City of Seattle, they have them back to the Civil War.
Really?
Yes. I was shocked too when I asked him. I called him up because I did research a set of plans for a building. I said, "How far back do you guys go?" Before I requested. He said, because I didn't know how far back they went. Every city's different. They said we go back to the Civil War. And I said, "Holy God!"
That is incredible. I mean, I can't imagine the level of discipline it must have taken to maintain that kind of record. That kind of records for that long.
Well, they're known for earthquakes, so they didn't know what was going on yet, like we do now.
Right.
And a lot of the buildings are historic, so they wanted to, I guess, keep everything so that people knew what they were building.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Well, what questions about us can I answer? I mean, obviously, it sounds like you were aware of who Greg was and a little bit of what he was doing at DPR, but where can I fill some gaps in for you, or help you better understand where we're going?
Okay, I'd like to know where we're going, where the company's going. First of all, I think is DPR going to be doing the design of the light gauge studs? I don't know how it works these days because in the old days, contractors subbed it out to a firm, and now they're getting into the point now where that's not happening anymore because the technology's gotten so much better now. And they're just, if the technology's getting to the point where it's eliminating the firm, or they're just grabbing the companies, to have them internally in staff, basically, because some of them can't find the engineers. So, like, companies like you're at DPR bought Greg Luce's firm. I'll use that as an example.
we do have a dedicated team of light gauge engineers. Currently, we've got, let's say, 3 people really full time. We're looking to bring on another, and then we've got one guy who is assisting, helping to manage that, but we're really trying to develop one of our existing people into that manager role. And so, but even with all that, with 4 or 5 people full time, we might only be doing 10 or 15% of the total footprint of light gauge engineering work for DPR nationally. Obviously, the West Coast projects are much more complicated because it's not just the structural systems; it's all the secondary framing. So, those are clearly more complicated. Really, bringing GPLA into DPR. So DPR internally has an initiative that they call Design to Build, and it's very deliberately not called Design Build. And so what that means is, DPR, as they try to lean into projects and take on more responsibility, and they choose taking on more responsibility as a way to help manage their overall risk on the project. As they saw the design industry struggling to produce constructible documents, for years they went back and forth on the best way to deal with that. So it started with this idea of design managers who would engage and really work during the design phase on a job that DPR knew they would build. The design managers would kind of work with the design team to help validate that it was constructible, help them identify ways to make it easier to build, things like that. And then at some point, part of that, they started really pursuing this idea of prefabrication as a necessary part of improving the way buildings are built. And very quickly, what they realized is if you don't control design or have an influence on design, it's very difficult to prefabricate the project. And so, fast forward that over the period of a couple of years, and the decision was made to sort of wade into the idea of direct engagement with the design through purchasing DPLA to, and they're very concerned about not wanting to alienate the design industry per se. And so, structural was very relevant to DPR because they self-perform both light gauge and concrete. They're the 10th largest concrete contractor in the U.S. And so the idea was, well, we're going to engage in it, and we're really going to focus on how do we help it make our self-perform groups do better. Beyond that, they want to be able to understand how to work design build. They do have clients that have that as an expectation, and I would put them on the design build spectrum. They're still in the learning phases of how to do it really well. And so, the idea was to sort of get into it on the structural side because it's a critical path that allows them to help manage the risk and it allows them to support self-perform. But to put it in perspective, within GPLA, our goal is to not get beyond 50% of our work being for DPR. And so half of our work is outside clients that have no connection to DPR at all. Some of that is builders, some of that is architects, and some of that is owners. And it's a good mix of what I would call normal structural engineering work. The only caveat to that being is generally we don't chase low price work. So, if an architectural client is looking to bid us against 3 other engineering firms, we simply will walk away. That's not a relationship that we're interested in building. We're generally only going to be looking at projects where we're either the sole option for the project or we are, if we are in a competitive situation, it's got to be competitive with someone that we feel is legitimate at our level. And so, that generally works pretty well. The vast majority of what we do, over 90% of what we do, is really not competitively priced. And so, we're focusing again on, in California, obviously, high performance seismic work. We certainly like that. We like to work where we support DPR. Sorry, I got a fly in my car. But in a general sense, the idea is, we want to leverage. We want to be engaged in working on projects where there's an understanding of what we're bringing to the table. Both at a performance design level as well as having a really deep understanding of constructability, deep understanding of how to make jobs go smoother and better. We have a full steel detailing team on board. We have rebar detailing team on board. We have field services managers that are rebar installation industry, and all of that to inform our designs so that they're better on day one. But on the DPR side, a lot of times we come in as an additional team player to work with the existing engineer of record to help guide them to a better project. So it's pretty routine. Any given week we're probably looking at 2 or 3 jobs nationally, specifically through the lens of how do we achieve the engineering needs, but find a way to make it easier to build and fabricate. We're good, friendly partners with those engineers of record. We're never doing it to try to undermine their role. We're doing it to try to make the project better for everyone.
Yeah, no.
Firms have been very, very receptive to that input.
Yeah, my question for you is, like, if this were inside DPR, what type of person would you call that? Where they go, like if I were a structural engineer and go through it, go through the project, say, "Oops, guys, would you like to do this or do that?" Because I've seen that with the contractors too, where they, we can't get this piece of steel. It's going to be 3 months. Will you accept piece B? It looks like we lost him.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm here if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, your video froze, so I didn't know what was going on. And I can't hear you now.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I hear you now, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of bad pockets on this highway that I know of. I just went through one of them, but I'll do the best I can. If I start to freeze or go bad, let me know, and I can usually get it picked back up. But yeah, what I would say is a lot of what we're doing is not just tweaking the job. Like for example, we just looked at a job at University of Miami for DPR, and looking at this project and saying, and that's a reinforced concrete post-tension building. Where we're going in and we're coming back to the table saying, all right, hey, here's some areas where the shoring situation is going to be difficult to deal with, and if we make some changes in the design, it enables a much cleaner shoring process. Or, they have a lot of column transfers. So, we're particularly high up in the building where it was complicated to deal with them. We're coming back in and we're saying, hey, we see what you want to get. We see where you want to go with this. Here's some ways to rethink the way you're framing the building that will either eliminate the transfers or that would, enable the transfers to be made more efficiently. And so a lot of the time what we're doing is coming in at like an SD, early DD level to try to identify not ways to shave 3% out of the building and say, hey, you can take 3 pounds of foot off that beam. It's generally saying, hey, here's a way to lay that building out that will save significant dollars in construction. And, my experience, is generally buildings get over-designed. And a lot of times it's not enough time, not enough fee. So what we're trying to do is work around that by saying at a DPR level, it's worth it for them to spend money on us to, number one, identify those areas. Number two, do the pre-work so that the engineer of record can minimize their amount of pre-work. And we can say, look, we've already looked at the optimal solution. Here's what it is. Here's all of our data, and really enable them to get there without having to go back through major, costly redesigns that they're going to struggle to get feed for. So we try to step into that partner because we don't have the fee constraints that they do, and really say, all right, what can we do to make it easier for you to get this building to a good place? And then generally, we will then come into construction. We pick up all the delegated designs. We'll pick up any, shoring, enabling engineering, things like that as well. So, really the goal is to be a project partner with everyone. And again, now there are cases where it's just truly awful engineering. And, if we catch it early on enough, we'll call out what it is. But most firms want to do good work. And what you find is a lot of the reasons why they lay a building out in a way that is not cost effective to build is because they don't understand the implications of the decisions. So we're trying to bring that to the table for them as early as possible so that they don't have a lot of rework. Our goal is everybody makes money, everybody has a great job, and the owner's happy, and then boom, everyone gets the next job. And so, like I said, and then there will be times, sometimes we did this a good bit in California, particularly in the concrete work, where basic design, we'll relay out the reinforcing systems in the concrete in such a way that we can shift it towards a prefabricated cage approach, where instead of going out there with loose bar and tying in the field, we'll re-engineer it so that it can be done with prefab cages. And some of that is shifting splice zones, some of that is reconfiguring bar layouts. We have very, very extensive modeling capabilities. We work in Tekla.
Yep.
So we can model all the rebar to the fabrication level. And so a lot of times we'll bring that to the table too, and we'll say, hey, we see what you want to achieve. We understand it because we're California engineers too. We would like to do it this way because it'll allow us to prefabricate the whole reinforcing system, and we provide everything back to them to enable them to say, sure, I get it, that makes sense, let's do it that way. And again, the goal is acknowledging the fact that they're not going to have the fee to do it. Because we are working through DPR, we have an incentive to get it done. And in a lot of these cases, we're going to spend $50,000, but we're going to save DPR $500,000. And the goal is to give everybody a better project that goes smoother and more successfully. And so again, the engineering firms that we've done that with we've done it with Pace, we've done it with Rutherford Kane, we've done it with I'm going to draw a blank. I mean, a lot of these firms are very familiar with us doing it. And again, we don't do it to undermine them. We're doing it to make the job work better for everybody.
That's the problem these days.
A little bit of that everywhere.
Yeah, the problem is, and I see this too, is the not enough fee thing. They get in a bind. And I worked for a client recently that, the architect was directing the design. And I didn't get a chance to get involved before it happened. It happened before I got on board. And all of a sudden, they can't build it. So we go back in and rework it, and I figure out a few different things. And then, basically, I lost my contract on one of them because the client lowballed the work to get it. The architect lowballed the work to get it, and there wasn't enough budget for the structural. And that's a problem, and my favorite excuse was, you shouldn't fix it because, quote, there's no budget. The problem with that is, in my terms, because I'm licensed as a structural engineer in California, if you get caught doing that, you lose your license. That's a problem, and that's a hard license to get too. It's structural. You lose that license, you're done. California is one of the hardest states to get the structural engineer license because one of the reasons is that the exam pass rate is 25%. That I'll put it to you in blunt terms: 3 out of every 4 people fail the exam.
Or do they lean in, try to engage deeper, and just try to solve the problem before they're, the steel's going up in the air? And obviously, you can see the direction they chose. And, again, so that's the big picture of why it happened. I think for Greg, it fit with his overall overriding goal. Greg has always been focused on this idea of engineering should encompass the whole job. It should think about the whole project all the way through when it's built, including fabrication. And so he's been advancing this idea of doing fabrication modeling for, I want to say he started, I think, in like the early 2000s. When I had my company, we started in 2009, but the idea was, as an engineering firm, we want to have engagement in that process more than just reviewing someone else's documents. And so, he had already been going down that path of blurring the line between design and everything that comes after. So I think the opportunity with DPR to do it and to really chase this idea of doing it in an integrated way was appealing. And so that's how that came about. I think it is a good fit. And we have a strong team in California. We have, I think we're somewhere around 30 some people in the United States. We actually utilize one of the other DPR partner companies, Construct. They're based out in Western India. We have a lot of our detailers there. Our structural steel and rebar detailers are based there. They're all structural engineering degrees. So, they're also a cut above the average in the industry. And, really continuing to drive this vision Greg had actually share it, and the DPR would like to see it happen where, they can come to an owner and say, look, we can take enough control over enough of this project that we can make you guarantees in terms of how well it's going to go and how to really de-risk the project and make it more successful and less risky for everybody involved. And that's really the strategic long-term goal, is to get it there. And like I said, and then we want to do enough outside work that we stay sort of in tune with the industry, that we know what everyone's doing, we don't want to get caught completely in the DPR bubble. And so, like I said, our pockets outside of that the schools are really because we have years of expertise doing it. The casinos are, even on casinos, it's routine for us to do the detailing and fabrication work on those because, obviously, if you're a casino, schedule is everything. When you're pulling in $1 million a day, if you open a week early, that's real money. And so, they value that we can bring to the table this really good understanding of construction, streamlining all of it to make it go as smoothly and quickly as possible. And so, that we're doing, I think right now we have about probably 6 or 7 active casinos that we're working on, and then another 3 or 4 that are somewhere out in front of us that haven't started yet.
Are we talking Indian casinos or private casinos?
No, it's all private, all privately owned companies. I mean, we're doing work for the Caesars Group. We do work for Cordish companies. Thinking some of the others. It's a mix of some of the what I would call smaller to mid-sized casino owners. We're not really at the point where we're picking up a lot of Vegas casinos.
Mm-hmm.
A lot in through Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Pennsylvania. So these are I'd say casinos that are probably in the under 250 million range.
Okay.
We're not picking off the $1 billion ones out in Vegas.
Okay. Yeah, because Washington State, I lived in Washington State in the Seattle area. They have a lot of casinos, because the Indians are allowed to build them. That's the way their laws are set up.
Yeah, a lot of the western states, they're under Indian situations. We generally don't go there because our clients don't. Those are, from a legal standpoint, they're challenging projects because you're really operating under 2 different sets of laws. You're operating under the sovereign nation laws that the Indian reservations operate under, and U.S. law, which we operate under. So it just creates some tough pockets to work around. Plus, to be completely forthright about it, they chase low fees. And again, we're not really looking to be the low fee provider on jobs. And, so they're challenging projects, and there's not enough reason to go after them. And frankly, we don't need to do them. So we choose not to.
I see.
We have done a few over the years, but it was a unique situation. Generally because one of our clients made a decision to partner up, but even then, we're working for our client, which is a private developer.
So my question I got some other questions too. Basically, when will this position be filled up? Basically, how long are you anticipating it? Basically, and why is it open?
It's open because we're growing. I mean, we're actively growing. Our some of that's just driven by DPR demand. It's also going to be driven a little bit. We're going to be my non-compete when I sold my company expires in about 3 weeks. So we're anticipating a surge in demand on the East Coast from that, as a lot of my old clients reconnect.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have continued growth, and DPR would love us to be able to take on more work. We have a pretty clear understanding with them that they know we can't do it all, and we know we can't do it all. So right now we really strategically identify projects where the fit is good and where we can really have a significant impact. They'd love to have us take more, but we're also not interested in taking on work that we can't get done. And so our goal is really to continue to grow at, somewhere between 5 and 15 engineers a year for the next several years. And again, that's the big bucket. The more nuanced version is we definitely would like to develop a larger footprint in Texas. We would like to have some additional senior people in California to help oversee and run projects and mentor our younger engineers. And where it's coming from. It's not as if we have a defined target date. You know, I mean, and Moses knows this. You know, my mandate to Moses was, man, let's build a pipeline of people that we think are a good fit, and then let's do what we can to onboard them in a way that give them time to make sure that we're acclimating people well. You know, we don't have to grow any faster than we choose to, but at the same time, we have reason to want to grow. So, again, you know, we're less worried about filling seats than we are about finding great fits for the organization and for the culture and the type of work. We know that we're not a traditional firm in the sense of what everyone else does. And so we kind of are going into it knowing that we're not everybody wants to work in the kind of world that we do. You know, it can be very fast paced on the construction side. We are chasing very technical, complicated projects. I wouldn't say, we certainly have our share of routine stuff, but I wouldn't say that we have our share of things that are really demanding people to be technically very good at what they do. In California, some of it, but for example, on the East Coast, we certainly would anticipate to get into very complicated historical retrofits and rehabs and things like that. You know, as you can imagine, we got plenty of old buildings on the East Coast, and so I just had a conversation today with a guy. You know, we've got an old garage in Baltimore that he said, hey, we would really like to put a 6-story building on top of that. By the way, it's downtown. There's no site to build around it, so we have to figure out a way not just to build the 6 stories on top, but we also have to sit on top of the building while we build it. So, you know, that's the kind of, you know, we want jobs that are challenging. We're not necessarily looking to slam up boxes in a cornfield all day long.
Yeah. And the other thing also is they're going to run out of land to build soon, you know, because of all the flooding. You know, here in California, we're getting flooding. The water's got to go somewhere. Texas is great, you know, certain areas. They get rock. The problem is it's so close to the surface, the water has nowhere to go, so that's why they get floods.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, Texas got an almost inexhaustible demand to build buildings. And, you know, we're working on this hotel in Austin, and the whole hotel sits 15 feet above the ground. And the stream is actually designed to flow underneath the building. Because, you know, downtown Austin is very dense, very few buildable lots left, and, you know, we're literally going to build a building to be perched above an active stream. So, you know, again, I think we want people that can walk into that kind of environment, feel very comfortable. We want people who can think independently and for themselves. You know, we're very much a shared leadership model. You know, I lead the organization, but that's not to say that I make all the decisions. You know, I have a core group of leadership people that are part of it now, but we really, you know, we look for everybody from the organization top to bottom to bring ideas to the table, and so we want people that are comfortable speaking up for themselves, comfortable, you know, explaining their positions, and you know, our goal is to be the best, not necessarily the biggest, but we want to be able to compete with the biggest, best firms out there all day long, and really again advance this idea that, you know, putting out a set of drawings that's barely buildable is not okay.
No.
We feel by setting that example and by showing the success stories, we can drive the industry.
Yeah, because a lot of firms don't do that these days. And then on my end, I used to work with attorneys, and they don't like it. You know, the contractors get involved with the attorneys, and that's not fun, believe me.
Yeah, well, there aren't too many attorneys that love our approach. We are very lucky with DPR that both their internal attorneys and external insurance carriers, everything, have sort of wrapped their head around what we're trying to do. And, you know, I'm pretty sure we're the people that give them trouble sleeping at night, but it's okay. You know, when you're trying to do something different and new, you know, there's always a certain amount of nervousness, and you know, but you either do it and think it through, or you don't advance things, and it's as simple as that. So yeah, I mean that's the big picture. But like I said, the role is really part of our organic normal growth. You know, and it's looking for the right people, not just a bunch of people.
Yeah, and I get nervous, especially like with architecture it's like some architecture firms, when they do structural engineering services, the problem they bump into, they hire cheap, And I saw this years ago. They hired a guy that was cheap because he was cheap. They took him in, and then like 2 years later, he screwed over the firm. The firm literally lost so much money that they went belly up because they didn't hire the right people. I was one of the people they interviewed, and they hired a guy with 5 years experience, and he literally destroyed the firm. And this is
Yeah, I know plenty of firms who have an in-house person, but I mean, to put it in perspective, we routinely do engineering for people who have in-house engineering, and they might use their in-house guys for the simple stuff, but they don't use their in-house guys for the complicated stuff. And that's our preferred place to be. You know, we're not necessarily chasing everybody's easy jobs. We'll do for good clients. You know, you do whatever work they have, but again, you know, we're realistic that we're not the cheapest guys in town, and that's okay. You know, we don't have to occupy the entire market. We want to occupy the part we want to.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. So what's the next step in this process after I interview you, Matt? If you're Mr. Moses or Matt, if I don't know, MM, you know, what's the plan?
Yeah, we call him Moses. What I would say is, you know, particularly because you're in San Jose, it actually might make it a little easier, but I would definitely want to have you have a chance to talk to, sorry, I got to make a right turn here without dying. Definitely would want to have a chance for you to talk to, so Jeff Jellick and Chris Blair. Jeff Jellick is essentially oversees and manages all the workflow throughout the organization, making sure that we get it in the right people's hands, making sure the projects are getting resourced and staffed properly. Chris does the same thing for all of our detailing and modeling. And then I'd like you to meet Tim Scrotenborg. Tim is our guy who's leadership in California. So definitely that group of three. And then obviously we would want you to have a chance to sit down with Greg Luce, hear Greg's story directly from him, if you haven't already, and really, you know, sort of hear what he was hoping to achieve. That's what I would say is really the next step as we try to coordinate that. It may be able to be a call with Chris and Jeff. Chris is in Florida. Jeff is in Pennsylvania. Tim and Greg are obviously in the Santa Clara office. So there, I think we would simply set that up to be in person.
Yep.
Sometimes with the meetings there, we probably try to roll it into meeting those two guys, but then also, you know, get a chance to meet some of the other engineers that work in the California office, because presumably that would be the home base that you would use. Yeah, that would be the next step in my mind. And then, you know, really from there, on both ends, you're doing an assessment, we're doing an assessment, making sure that we all feel like the fit makes sense. And then if it does, then we move on to the business side of it. So that's been our process. It can go faster or slower. I mean, like I said, we're pretty flexible. We don't have anything that would approach a target date. Again, in terms of where you would plug in, we're really looking for somebody who can walk in, lead projects, you know, of whatever size we have. It would be leading. We would probably, in a case like you specifically, we'd probably really try to focus on California because you have that experience. You know, right now, Tim is trying to wear two hats, which is trying to lead projects and trying to lead the office. And, you know, the poor guy never gets a break. We would really like to have him. The business side and support of the staff and everything else. So really, I would think you'd be largely plugging in and taking that workload off of Tim in the short term, and then long term, again, just growing with the organization.
Yeah, and the other thing.
I'm a very strong believer in teaching and mentoring. We have a lot of. Go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing too is it's going to take me a while to catch up to speed the way you do things, you know, because everybody does things differently, and I want to do it the right way and know where stuff is. That's going to take a little while for me because I want to get it right the first time. I don't want to BS it, you know, and then basically somebody goes look for a job later and they can't find it because it wasn't put in the proper place.
Based out of the California office makes it easy because we've got a lot of long-term employees there. We do have some retirements coming, including Greg, and so obviously there's an overlap there that's beneficial, but yeah, I mean, there's a good support structure there to figure that out. And like I said, a really good group of young up-and-coming engineers. We want them to have a great teaching and mentoring experience. You know, they've had Greg there, they've got Tim there, and we've got a few mid-career people, but obviously, you know, we'd like to have good expertise and good senior engineers there to help them learn and grow and develop. And great group of kids, but you know, they're still nipping away at it. They're still learning a lot. So, you know, that's what I would say is sort of the big picture of that. Yeah, process-wise, we would simply have probably a virtual version and an in-person version to talk further.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your. Do you have any other additional questions for me?
I'd say I could get into some of the technicals. I mean, I looked through your CV and that stuff. But I mean, look, I think it's not going to be an issue of you knowing how to tackle or do the projects. I don't see that being a particular barrier. I think it's not like we're expecting you to jump in and be a technical user. Listen, as much as I'm a fan and believer in using Tekla because it allows us to go to fabrication, I myself, I'm pretty terrible in it. You know, and so I don't necessarily think that we're going to dig deep on the software issues. You use all the usual design stuff like we all have. So again, I don't see that being a particular concern. I think if anything, it'd be great. In an in-person interview, I think you'd have a chance to talk to some of the people who've done the DSA, who've done the other California approval type stuff. They better to have that like Tim. Tim and Greg and those guys, they can dig in deeper on some of that if they wanted to know a little bit more. I know just enough about it to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think beyond that, what I see is valuable is a pretty diverse set of experience, diverse set of project types, the experience dealing with the review agencies, and even being in a review role. I think all of that is valuable, and I could see a place for it with what we're doing. I'm assuming, and this may or may not be a fair assumption, that that your exposure to the fabrication world is really limited to having reviewed other people's shops. They didn't really pick up any of the firms you were involved in, went down that path like we do. So I'm not really expecting that to be something you're familiar with, other than the extent to which all of us are familiar with shop drawings in that process.
Yeah.
Really for us, it's just an internal one as opposed to being an external one.
Yeah.
It's not conceptually different. It's just a different place those people sit. Long-term goals, I'd certainly like to hear a little bit about what your long-term plan, long-term goals are for you. You mentioned a place that's stable, that's I read has a good runway in front of it that you don't have to worry about us dropping off the face of the earth anytime soon. I don't see that happening. Of course, everybody says that. I can tell you that what we're doing is one of the core strategies within DPR at a top of the leadership level on down. So we're not an experiment, is I guess what I would say. We are a critical core part of their strategy, and they're not testing the waters. They're actually expanding their engagement in it as we go forward. And so I don't see it being a particularly risky role to be in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a Katera company where they bit off more than they could do. Years ago, I interviewed with them, and they were first they were doing wood buildings. They were just buying up companies. And then when I interviewed with them, they were trying to get into light gauge, and they wanted typical details. And I said, guys, your website has wood. What's going on here? And then like a year, 2 years later, they went belly up because it was poorly managed. And they didn't.
Yeah.
They were redoing their projects over and over again, pretty much.
I'm glad you mentioned Katera, because here's what I'll say. Within DPR, that story is so well known, and there are people who came out of that mess. And, DPR is absolutely trying to do some of the things that Katera talked about doing. The difference is Katera came at it from the standpoint of, well, the construction industry doesn't know what the hell they're doing. We're going to come in and fix it, and we're going to do it better. And what you realize when you're in this industry for a while is that's a fantasy. If it were that easy, we would all have done it long can have a significant impact, and then let's make sure it works. And it's okay if it doesn't have to happen in 6 months. If it takes us a couple of years to solve a problem, that's okay. You know, and so it's really coming at it from a builder's perspective of, yeah, we all know there are issues, but it's not this simple thing of flip a switch and just make it like building an iPhone. It's far more complicated. It's much more challenging. And, you know, we are going to find a way to do prefab better, and we are going to find a way to integrate better. But we're solving this with boots on the ground, and we're not doing it based on a false sense of confidence. We're doing it based on having the right people at the table, the right expertise. Frankly, a certain amount of gray hair sitting at the table.
Yeah, when I was at Katera, they had no gray hairs at all. I was literally the only one in there when I visited their Seattle office, and the guy bragged about having, hiring all the structural engineers in Seattle. And that, to me, was strange, and I thought the other thing was strange was he was asking for typical details for light gauge, and I said, why are you asking this, And later, they didn't, there was literally no job. So, and part of it is, the management of the company, and then they found out SoftBank managed it, and you probably remember, they're the ones that did WeWork, which was a whole movie about it, basically, with...
They were grossly overconfident. Put in perspective, we're working on light gauge typical details that we can use nationwide, but we started with the guys in the field who framed the building. We started the conversation with them and we would say, what things would make your job easier how are the ways that if we could, there might be 10 ways to put it together. Which of those 10 ways is the easiest for you? Then we look at the engineering and say, can we engineer that? And if we can engineer what is easy for them to build, and then if we can build it to allow for the kind of tolerances that construction needs, now we're starting to find solutions. And so, you start with the premise of asking the people who actually physically do it to say, what would make your job easier? Instead of me telling you how to do it better, what makes your job easier? And the thousands of employees within DPR that we filtered that information out of, all across the United States, all different markets, all different project types, and say, let's gather all the data first, and let's look at it and say, is there a common thread we can identify that we can do? Then can we apply engineering to it and make it work? And again, then when you find those solutions, they've been vetted out, they're going to work, because you started with the premise of the people that actually have to put it in place. And, so it's just a completely, it's like a backwards version of Katera. Instead of telling the world how we're going to solve the problems, we ask the world what problems we need to solve first.
Yeah.
And then interestingly, you start to uncover other things that people hadn't thought about by having those conversations. And because we're sitting there looking at all of it, you can start to identify how to pull it together into a cohesive whole. And so it's a slower process. It probably wouldn't be as exciting for a bunch of tech employees. But again, we're not doing this for a short-term return. We're doing this because we want to be the ones that lead the industry, and we want it to be right.
Yeah, and that's more important because you get the next job. When you lowball the work, it's a vicious cycle. You keep lowballing, and you're done.
Yep.
People remember that.
Yeah, agreed. And I apologize. I do have to jump. We're actually doing a job at Disney, and I have to get on a call. This is our introduction.
I'll let you go. I'm going to let you go right now. Don't say anything more.
So Moses will be back in touch with you in terms of next steps. Moses, you and I are going to have to reconnect if you're still listening on timing. I got to get on this call quick. So
yep.
I don't know if he hears us or not. But
I'm going to hang up right now because you get...
Yeah, it was great talking to you. You go by Michael or Mike?
Michael's fine.
All right. It was great talking to you. I really enjoyed it. Look forward to hearing from us.
Thanks, Josh. I'm going to hang up right now. Bye.